Well, hello, wherever you're watching this or however you're watching this. It is great to be with you and to share just in this little slightly strange way online, as we've got used to doing in your day of re-envisioning and study for the Diocese of Sheffield. It's been great to know Bishop Pete for many years and to support him and all of you in the ministry that you have, the calling you have to be the Church of Jesus Christ in your part of the country. I guess a lot of the time in church life, we get ourselves consumed by all the busyness of church life, all the PCCs and synods and the fabric and the budgets and the rotas and the services and everything else that we have to do in church all the time. But I want for a few minutes today just to step back from that a little bit and ask the question, what is the church for? Why do we do it? Why do we get up in the morning and go to church on a Sunday? Why do we pour ourselves into the life of the church in the way that we do? But I think in order to answer that question, what is the church for, we need to ask a prior question. And that question is, what is the world for? Why was this world created? Because unless we get an answer to that question, we can't really understand what the church is for. Now, you could come up with all kinds of answers to the question of why did God create the world? It's almost an impossible question to answer. We can't see entirely into the mind of God to know exactly what went on, and when, if you like, that divine decision was taken to create a world. But I think if there's one answer I would give, and particularly that comes from the book of Psalms, because of course the doctrine of creation in the Bible is not just there in Genesis, it's there in other texts such as the book of Isaiah, the book of Psalms as well. If there's one answer that I think I would give is, why was the world created? It was created for joy. It was created to bring joy to God, but also to bring joy to us and the rest of creation as well. You find texts like Psalm 104 where it says this, "May the glory of the Lord endure forever. May the Lord rejoice in his works." God seems to have created the world so that he might rejoice in it, so that he might look upon it, as it says in the book of Genesis, and see that it was good. The world was created for the joy of God, that he might enjoy his creation. But it's not just a sort of selfish act by God to create something that he might enjoy, but he creates a world so that it might find joy in itself and in its relationship with God. And so in Psalm 96, we read these words, "Let the heavens rejoice, let the earth be glad, let the sea resound and all that is in it. Let the fields be jubilant and everything in them. Let all the trees of the forest sing for joy. Let all creation rejoice before the Lord, for he comes to judge the earth." And you get that note quite often in the Psalms, that idea of creation rejoicing before the Lord, the fields, the mountains, the trees, all rejoicing in God. So the world was created to bring joy. It exists to give God joy and to give us joy. That's the way it was meant to work. In other words, the world was not created as a means to an end. It wasn't created to bring into being servants for God to do his work for him, as some of the Babylonian myths had it at the time of the creation of the book of Genesis and the rise of Israel. It was created so that God might look at it and say, it is good, and that we might enjoy God through his creation and enjoy the rest of creation too. Now, how does that joy come about? How did it come to be that God enjoys his creation and we enjoy that creation with God too? And I think the answer is that we enjoy creation and God enjoys it when it receives God's blessing. The earth rejoices when it lives in the blessing of God. And God, if you like, rejoices when he sees the world living under his blessing. Now, there is a key text, I think, in the New Testament that takes us to the heart of this idea of God's relationship with the world and the relationship with the church, particularly within that economy, within that dynamic, if you like, of God's relationship with the world. And the text is 1 Peter chapter 2, and we find it saying this. It's a well-known passage, you'll know it well, but this is what it says. "You are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you might declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul." Now here's a picture of the church, a chosen people, a royal priesthood. Now, that word priesthood, the church is a royal priesthood. There's a particular kind of reference to it because, of course, it picks up a lot of language in the Old Testament about priesthood too. And it refers, I think, to a pattern where God chooses a part to bless the whole. God brings his blessing to bear upon the world by choosing a part to bless the whole. Now, we see this pattern happening again and again in the Bible. So, for example, in creation, in Genesis, we read how he creates all the species of life on the planet, but he chooses one of them, humanity, Homo sapiens, to be the means of blessing the rest. And so he chooses humanity to bear his image. And bearing that image carries with it the responsibility to nurture and to care for the rest of creation. Human beings, to that degree, are priests of creation. We have a human calling to care for and to nurture and to develop the rest of creation. We see it in the church itself. We find out of the church, God chooses some people, some individual people, to be the means of blessing the rest of the church. That's why we call them priests. They are people called out of the church to enable the church to be itself and to flourish, to organize, to order, to remind the church of its true calling. Here is this pattern of God choosing a part to bless the whole. That's what priesthood is all about. But and this is what I want to focus on today. It's true of the church itself, because that reading from Peter said this: that the church is a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a people chosen out of the rest of the human race in order to bless the rest of the human race. You see the pattern? You see humanity chosen out of all the species of the world to bless the rest of the world. Priests chosen out of the church to bless the rest of the church. But if you like, in the middle of those, the church called out of the whole of the human race to bring God's blessing to the rest of the human race. And that is our calling as the church. It is to be a blessing to the world, to the communities that we live in, the particular places, parishes we call them, into which God has placed us. Now, how do we do that? How does the church bring the blessing of God to its community and the world in which we're placed, and particularly to the human race, the human community and societies in which we are located? Well, again, go back to one of the phrases in that text. It says this: that the church is a chosen people, a royal priesthood, called to declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. In other words, the primary task of the church is to declare the praises of God. Now, you might ask the question, who do we declare the praises of God to? And again, I think there are two answers to that question. The first is that we declare the praises of God to God. It's the primary calling of the church, to worship, to rejoice, to declare the praises of God to God. That's the first calling of the church, to be joyful, to joyfully proclaim back to God his goodness and the goodness of the world that he's created. That is our calling. It is to worship. Now, it's not because God needs that. Of course, God doesn't need to be reminded how good he is. It's because we need it. We need it, and the rest of the world needs it. We, on behalf of the whole of the rest of the world, until they catch up one day, are called to worship and declare the praises of God to God. Because we need to be reminded again and again of how good God is, what a good world this is. We need to be reminded of how far we have fallen short of his calling and how much we need forgiveness. And yet we're also called to remember again and again the goodness of his salvation for us. And so the first calling of the church is to rejoice. It's to express our joy at living in such a beautiful world, to express our sorrow at the damage we have done, to give thanks for the rescue, the forgiveness, the grace that we've been given in Jesus Christ. Our first calling as the church is to gaze into the face of Jesus Christ and the God that is revealed through him. Now, we all do that in different ways, different parts of the church, worship in different styles. The style, if you like, is secondary. It's the calling that is primary. Our first calling is to declare the praises of God to God in worship. And if I can just add one note at this point, if you think of that is our primary calling as the church, to worship God and to bring joy to God by that very action. It says something, I think, about our perpetual anxiety in the church about survival. One of the things we often worry about in the church is we think of the decline of the church in recent times. We think is, well, is the church going to survive into the next generation? We're worried about cuts of money and clergy posts and everything else. Very often you hear in the church the cry, the church won't be here in 20 years' time if we do nothing. But it seems to me that's not a good reason for action in the church. Because if we spend all our time focusing and worrying about survival, if that's our focus, then we're focusing on survival, we're not focusing upon Christ. And the calling of the church is not to worry about its own survival, it's to gaze into the face of Jesus Christ, to be caught up in worship of God. A church that focuses on survival is doomed. Paradoxically, the more concerned we are with survival, the more likely we are to die. Because if we're focused on survival, we're turned in upon ourselves, we worry about our own institution. And that idea of turning in upon ourselves is, of course, Martin Luther's great definition of sin, the heart curved in upon itself. There's a book by a theologian called Michael Jenkins called The Church Faces Death. And he says this in that book, is the church is most attractive when it pursues its own vocation, unconcerned with its own survival. The church will thrive to the degree to which it is fascinated and caught up in the worship of Jesus Christ. Because the more we're caught up in the worship of Jesus Christ, as we'll talk about in a moment, the more we begin to share that news. If we're focused on survival, it's anxious, it's narrowing, it doesn't really help us in any great way. So we are to focus on God, not survival. And we do that by doing what we do best, and what is our first calling as the church, to worship. But there's a second calling of the church, the second way in which the church enacts this call to be a blessing to the world, to be this royal priesthood in the world. And that is by declaring the praises of God, not just to God, but to the world. And so if you like, if the first calling of the church is worship, the second calling of the church is witness. Now, I use that word advisedly. Walter Brueggemann, who's one of the great Old Testament scholars of our day, has written how the stance of the church towards the world these days has to be not so much proclamation, because that assumes a kind of common foundation for knowledge, a common understanding between the church and the world, but actually he said it's primarily witness. It is testimony. It's giving testimony of what he calls an alternative truth. Now, that may be especially true for us today. We're getting used to the idea of the church as a minority within a world, within a society which is largely not Christian. It still has some of the trappings of Christendom, but they are eroding over time. And this is our calling, is to bear witness in a world that has forgotten of the goodness and the grace and the salvation of God in Jesus Christ. It is to show there is a different way of living, bear witnessing to that different way of living. Again, Brueggemann puts it this way, is to make the case in the empire for a different truth, a different presentation of reality, a different basis for humanity in the world. It's to bear witness to our world that this world doesn't have to be this way. It doesn't have to be the kind of world where thousands of people are caught in a building safety crisis, or many families are going hungry because they don't have food to eat. Where in Afghanistan, people are having to flee because of the fear of what's going to happen in the future. It doesn't have to be this way. There is a different way of living, a different order of things. Now, the New Testament language for that, of course, is simple. It's the reign of God. It's the kingdom of God. It is to say that when God's kingdom comes, and we can see it in part now, but one day it will come in its fullness, this world will be different. And it's bearing witness to that kingdom that is our calling. It's to declare the praises of God to the world. Now, we do that in all kinds of ways, and I want to go into detail on that in a moment, but we do it particularly in three ways. We announce the kingdom. That's what Jesus did. The kingdom of God has come among you. Part of what we do is just simply announcing it, to say to people that the kingdom of God has come amongst you, and you can see signs of it around us. It's our task to describe the kingdom. That's what Jesus does again. He describes the kingdom in parables of sowers and seeds and pearls and merchants. We find imaginative ways to give people an idea of what the kingdom of God is like and will be like. He announces a new reality, that this world might be different. That's what Jesus does in the parables of the kingdom. And so in our bearing witness to the kingdom, in our declaring the praises of God to the world, we're to use imagination, art and poetry and story and narrative, not just argument, as we try to depict for people what the kingdom of God looks like. And we're also called to embody that kingdom. Again, that's what Jesus does. He doesn't just announce the kingdom, doesn't just describe it, he embodies it. And so in his miracles, you see the kingdom coming. Because every time someone finds healing, it's a little sign of what life is like when God is in charge, when the kingdom comes. Every time someone finds a healing, whether now or in the ministry of Jesus, it was a sign of the kingdom. When he fed the crowds, it was a sign of the day when no one will go hungry. And when he does those nature miracles, walking on the water, it's a sign of nature transformed, enabling people to find a different way of life. So just as Jesus announced the kingdom, described the kingdom, and embodies the kingdom, that's what we are called to do. That's how we declare the praises of God to the world. And so the church is to bear witness to the kingdom. Now, the church is not the kingdom. We know there's all kinds of stuff that goes on in the church which isn't part of the kingdom of God. We fail in this day after day after day, but we still come back again and again to these two primary tasks of the church: to declare the praises of God to God in worship, to declare the praises of God to the world in witness. We bear witness that Jesus Christ is the true Lord and King of this world. He has triumphed over sin and death and hell and everything that opposes human life. And we are invited to be involved in God's work of bringing all things under the rule of Christ. Now, so where we got to so far, we thought about how the world was created for joy. And in order to bring about that joy, in order for that joy to take place, for God to rejoice in his creation and creation to rejoice in God, the creation needs to know God's blessing. And it's for that reason that God has called the church apart from the rest of humanity to be a means of blessing to the rest of the human race, and particularly the communities in which we found ourselves. And we do that by fulfilling our two primary callings: to declare the praises of God to God in worship, and declare the praises of God to the world in witness. Now, I want to focus for the rest of my time today on that second part of it, witness. How do we do that? How do we bear witness? We talked about ways in which we do that, declaring and describing and embodying, but I want to go into detail on that for a little bit and to kind of give you a bit of a scheme as to how this works. Now, witness, of course, is always contested. That's the point of witness. When you go into a courtroom and you're asked to give your witness, you tell your story, you tell of what you have seen. Now, of course, another witness might come along and say, no, it wasn't like that. It's always contested witness, but we don't worry about that. We just give witness anyway. The fact that everyone doesn't agree with it, the fact that people don't necessarily listen to it, doesn't matter. We just give our witness, find ways to bear witness to the kingdom of God. Now, again, just dig into this for a moment. The kingdom of God is the world set right. It's the way it was always meant to be. If you think for a moment, Jesus announced the kingdom in his ministry. And what I think he meant was that when he said, the kingdom of God is come among you, just around Jesus, you could see the kingdom coming. There's that moment when the disciples of John the Baptist come to Jesus and they say, who are you? Who should we tell? What's going on here? And he says to them, well, go back and tell John that the sick are healed, the dead are raised, the kingdom of God has come among you. In other words, around Jesus, you can see life restored to the way it was always meant to be. Sick people getting healed, dead people rising, hungry people getting fed, the poor finding dignity. You can find that's just in this little space around Jesus, you see the kingdom of God coming. You see the world set right. And that is what the church is to do. The church bears witness to the kingdom by showing the world what a world set right might look like. Gregory of Nyssa, one of the great early Christian theologians, said this. He said, the establishment of the church is the recreation of the world. Really interesting phrase, that. The establishment of the church is the recreation of the world. Yes, this idea that somehow in launching the church, in the beginning of the church, God was somehow recreating the world, starting something new, refreshing, rebooting the world, as it were. And again, John Calvin, one of the great 16th century reformers, has a similar sort of idea. He talks about the church as the restoration of the order that was lost at the fall. And what he means by that is that the world was created as this wonderfully ordered place, and yet it's become disordered through human sin and brokenness. And the message of the scriptures is that God has not given up upon the world, and that in Jesus Christ he has acted decisively to bring order back to the world. The church is now engaged in the task of showing what that order looks like. Now, if that's true, if the kingdom of God is the world set right, then the church has this task of bearing witness by showing what a world set right might look like. And that means, if we take Calvin's idea for a moment, the idea of the church as a restoration of the order lost at the fall, we might say that the relationships that have been broken in our world are restored in the kingdom of God. Just think about this for a moment. In the book of Genesis, we get a picture of creation as a place of order, of harmonious relationships. We get God and humanity and the rest of creation all in harmony with one another in the Garden of Eden. And then, of course, the great tragedy happens. The fall takes place. Human sin enters in, and those relationships are then broken. And so we find our relationship with God broken as the human beings in the garden hide from God. They don't want to see him. When God walks in the garden, Adam and Eve just hide in the corner. It's never a good sign of a relationship if you're hiding from someone you don't want to see them. Our relationship with each other is broken. Adam and Eve start blaming each other for what's gone on. Chapter 4 of Genesis, Cain and Abel, two brothers, fall out over the worship of God. Our relationship with each other is broken. Even our relationship with the created order, the stuff of the world around us is broken too. Chapter 3, we find the serpent becoming an enemy of the humans. We find chapter 6 to 7, the flood threatening to wipe out human race. Nature becomes an enemy, not a friend. We even find our relationship with ourselves broken as well. In chapter 3, we get that sense that the man and the woman were suddenly aware that they were naked, that they had to hide from one another. Shame enters into human relationship, and self-consciousness becomes crucially part of our experience of the world. We're no longer relaxed within our own bodies and our own skin. We're anxious, we're fearful about what others think about us, and so on. And then even our relationship with this wonderful gift of language that we've been given is broken as well. Language which was meant to bind us together by communicating ideas and expressing love and care for one another becomes a source of disunity. As the Tower of Babel is a symbol, if you like, of human pride. And God breaks down the tower, and as a result, language is broken as part of the judgment of God. So here is this fractured picture of a world that is not right. The relationships created within the world are broken apart. And if we were to take Gregory of Nyssa and Calvin's idea seriously, I think they would say to us this: what do you think you're doing in church? When you go to church on a Sunday morning, or when you gather in your home group on a Wednesday night, or whatever it is that you do, when you engage in church, what do you think you're doing? You're not just going along to sing a few hymns, or say a few words, see a few friends. You're doing nothing less than being involved in the restoration of creation, bringing back together a broken creation, and therefore bearing witness to the world, declaring the praises of God to the world. Now, if that's the brokenness of our world, how is that brokenness in the world restored? And how is it borne witness to by the church? And I want to offer you a five-fold framework for thinking about this and how the church bears witness to the kingdom of God. And it relates to those 5 broken relationships with God, with each other, with the creation, with ourselves, and then with our human language. And it does it in a way that maybe helps you remember, because each of the 5 items begins with a different letter, A, B, C, D, E. So you can follow it as you go along and see if you can see the pattern developing. So first of all, if in our experience of the world, this world that has gone wrong, is right at the heart of that is our broken relationship with God. That's what we see in the book of Genesis, that broken relationship with God. And the answer to that is, number one, adoration. We are brought back into relationship with God, where we're enabled to see God in the face of Jesus Christ, that in the coming of Christ, the incarnation, his death, his resurrection, his miracles, his life, his revelation of God, we are enabled to see God again. He makes a way for us to be restored to him so that we can worship him again in the way that we were always meant to as the human race. In the kingdom of God, we see a relationship with God restored so that we can turn our gaze away from ourselves towards the God who made and redeemed us. And so this is, again, back to our thing, the first calling of the church is worship, it's adoration. There's that moment in 1 Corinthians 12 where St. Paul talks about the worship of the church in Corinth. And he talks about how someone who's maybe not a believer would come into the church. And he says, what happens in church? Well, they come in and he says, the secrets of their hearts are laid bare. They fall down and they worship God, exclaiming, God is really among you. Now, I find that a bit of a challenge because I ask that of my churches in the area that I'm responsible for as bishop. If an outsider just was to walk into one of our parish churches on a Sunday, would they fall down and worship God, exclaiming, God is really among you? Or would they just say, well, it's just another thing going on like anything else? And that's our calling. It's adoration, it's worship that is so engaging, so powerful, so riveting, if you like, that it enables people to realize that God is here. It's that kind of worship. Now, the style is secondary. You can do this in all kinds of different ways, more informal, liturgical, whatever it is. That's not the point. The point is that if we're to bear witness to the kingdom of God, we will need to be to enable people to find their relationship with God restored in worship. And so that may be something, again, to go away and think about when you go back to your parishes. Is our worship the kind that would enable people to come in off the streets and say, God is really among you? Is there something we can do to make sure our worship is accessible, lively, but really focuses upon God and enables people to encounter God in those new ways, in that way? So there's the first thing, adoration. The second thing, the second relationship that we realize was broken in the fall is our relationship with each other. Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel. That's a sign of a broken world, broken relationships with each other. And therefore in the church, if the church is to be a witness to the kingdom of God, it will need to be a place that displays the second thing, which is belonging. In other words, restored relationships with each other. Now, this is what Jesus did. One of the first things he did was to draw together a community of 12 people who were very different. Matthew, the collaborator, the tax collector, Judas, the zealot, the opponent of the Romans, brought together into a space where they could be reconciled to one another. This sense of belonging, where different people are brought together, and especially today in a very fractured and polarized world, the power of Christ to draw together people who are very different is a powerful witness to the gospel and the kingdom of God. In the kingdom of God, there is no loneliness. Connection takes place. People feel they belong. You find a sense of real community where everyone feels welcome, accepted, and has a role to play. Now, in our broken and fractured world, the power of Christ to bring together difference is a powerful testimony to the kingdom of God. I often think of this a bit like if you imagine one of those industrial magnets that hovers over a rubbish tip, and suddenly you find the bits of iron drawn to the magnet, and you find old bicycles or car wheels or iron bars or household appliances suddenly are drawn together to this huge magnet. And what draws them together is not what holds them in common. There's a little bit of that because they're all made of iron or metal or whatever else it is, but it's the power of the magnet that draws these different things together. And that, if you like, is a testimony to the power of Christ to bring together difference, to create a sense of belonging, where people who are very different from one another in gender, in ethnicity, in age, sexuality, whatever it might be, can be drawn together into a place where they feel they belong. So that's our second thing that we do as a church. We create a sense of belonging that testifies to the power of Christ to bring people together. whether that's in small groups, whether it's in Zoom prayer gatherings, whether it's Sunday attendance, whatever else it might be. And it probably is more than just Sunday attendance, because to create a real sense of belonging, we need more than just 1 hour a week. There is this second aspect of being a witness to the kingdom by creating a sense of belonging. The third broken relationship we thought about in our narrative of the fall was our relationship with the created order. The serpent attacks and is an enemy to the human race. The flood threatens to wipe out the world. And in the kingdom of God, we find creation healed. And so in the ministry of Jesus, we see water, which was in the Old Testament, of course, a great symbol of destruction and an enemy and chaos, suddenly becomes a friend. Because what happens when Jesus steps into water, it supports him rather than drowns him. And these nature miracles we find, bread suddenly multiplying to feed people, water becoming a friend, supporting Jesus as he walks upon it, are a sign of creation healed, limbs that are straightened, that were not straight beforehand, sickness healed. All of that is a sign of creation restored. And a church that is a sign of the kingdom of God, a church that bears witness to the kingdom of God, that declares the praises of God to the world, is a church in which you can see something of creation being restored. And that might mean looking around at your little bit of creation and asking, what can we do to be a sign of creation restored where we are? What does that look like? Does it mean cleaning up graffiti in our local area? Does it mean sorting out a local park to make it more beautiful? Does it mean praying for healing? Does it mean actually reaching out to elderly people in our neighborhood and making them feel that they have a future and a hope and people who care for them? What are the things we can do? Does it mean care for creation in some radical way, recycling, whatever it might be, cycling to church on a Sunday rather than using our cars, if that's the possibility for you? What are the things we can do to express the compassion of God for his world? And that's the third thing that's there. So it's compassion. If you're adoration, belonging, and compassion. Compassion for our communities around us, our human community, but also our natural community as well. A church that is bearing witness to the kingdom of God will be a church in which you can see compassion. Compassion for people, compassion for the world, a sign of creation restored. The fourth broken relationship we thought of was our relationship with ourselves, that sense of shame that enters into human life, that element that we all have where we feel embarrassed about ourselves and we don't like ourselves a lot of the time. And this really refers to the fourth aspect of this church that is a sign of the kingdom, which is referring to what I call discipleship. A church that is a sign of the kingdom, a church that bears witness to the kingdom, will be a church that shows people a different way of life. That there is a different way of living. It will be a church that exercises the disciplines of the Christian life, because of course discipline is the same word as discipleship. Being a disciple of Jesus, a follower of Jesus, is someone who takes on the disciplines of Jesus. Those disciplines of silence and prayer and community and fellowship and generosity and abstinence, whatever those disciplines may be. It's learning to put in place those disciplines of daily prayer, maybe occasionally of fasting, of taking time aside from our normal activity to give our attention wholly to God, maybe on retreat from time to time. It's developing patterns that enable people to learn new patterns of behavior and break old habits and learn new ones. So many churches, for example, have started a rule of life, a simple rule of life, to say, okay, here's something we offer, not compulsory, but anybody who wants to might take on a rule of life, which is to say maybe 5 things. Come to church, a gathering once a week, be part of a small committed group of people learning the Christian faith together, being part of some small ministry to the poor, those who are less well off than we are, maybe engaging in one kind of learning exercise, maybe a course each year to develop our gifts or understanding, giving at least 10% of our income away, those sort of disciplines, to learn a different way of life, showing people that there is a different way of living, to learn the practices of discipleship. So we don't just talk about it, we actually show people how it can be done. And so this, if you like, discipleship really is all about a restored relationship with ourselves so that we become comfortable with ourselves in front of God. not self-satisfied, but at ease in our own skin, because we're learning a new way of life. We're becoming disciples of Jesus, being rebuilt from within, being healed, if you like, in our inner life and in our soul. And then the last relationship that we thought about was our relationship with language, our relationship with words, and how in the Tower of Babel, human language was fractured and broken. And this, I think, refers in the kingdom of God. In the kingdom of God, we find words transformed. Words are no longer something that create division, but they create unity. Words can be used to bring people back into fellowship with God and with each other. It's what we call in the church evangelism. That outreach, that invitation to people to come and explore, to find the possibility of relationship with God again, whether that's through an Alpha course or an Emmaus course or a Pilgrim course or whatever style you use. Again, the style doesn't matter. The key thing is the calling of evangelism. And evangelism is about words. It is about testifying verbally to our faith, whether that's one-to-one with a friend, just to saying, look, would you come to church with me on Sunday? It's the best form of evangelism you could possibly think, the simplest form. Just simply, would you come to church with me on Sunday? They may not come, so that's fine, but they may do. And when they come, they may discover God. They may find that God is really among you. They may discover an encounter with God in that experience. You never know. It may be in an Alpha course, it may be developing skills of an apologist or whatever it might be, but sharing our faith, finding a way of telling our story to anyone who will listen as to what being a Christian means to us. So there are 5 things. We've seen how in our world, our experience of the world, the order of the world was lost at the fall. Our relationships with God, with each other, with the created order, with ourselves, and even with language are broken apart. And in the kingdom of God, we find those relationships restored. And if the church is to be a witness to the kingdom of God, if it's to declare the praises of God to the world, it will need to be a place in which you can see those 5 things being restored. Now you have a little checklist there: adoration, belonging, compassion, discipleship, evangelism. And one of the things I sometimes do with our churches here is to simply offer them that little framework and say, okay, how do you think you're doing in those areas as a church? Which are you strongest at? Which are you weakest at? Very often people say, well, we're pretty good at worship. And, there is a sense of really the presence of God with us as we worship. We're pretty good at belonging, but maybe we're not so good at discipleship, and we're not so good at evangelism. And maybe that might give you an indication of where to focus your energies. But it's a framework to help us think about how we do this work. Now, let me draw this to a close. What we thought about today is that the world was created for the joy of God and the joy of the rest of creation. And the church is called out of the human race to enable joy to be found, to enable people everywhere to find the joy of knowing God. And we do that by focusing our attention upon God in worship and by declaring the praises of God to the world in witness. And we do that in these 5 ways: by being a sign of God's reign, a world put right again: adoration, belonging, compassion, discipleship, evangelism. And as I close, something happens, I think, when you find a church that does this. It awakens a memory. St. Augustine is one of my great theological heroes, one of the great theologians of the early church. And in his great work, Confessions, he has a chapter on memory. And he writes about how the human race has a kind of memory in our heads. We still have a sort of memory of what life was like back then in the days when the human race was in fellowship with God in the Garden of Eden. And we kind of instinctively know what it was like, and we're always searching for it. We're longing for it, but we can't quite find it. Hence his famous prayer, you've made us for yourselves, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. Well, I think when people encounter a church like this, where they find the possibility of a restored relationship with God, with other people, a sense of belonging, a renewed creation, compassion for the world, enabling them to express their compassion for the community around them, discipleship, a new way of living, habits changed and restored, and finding their own language used in a way that brings people back into fellowship with each other and God. When you encounter a church like that, it sparks the memory. And it says to people, yes, that's it. That's what I'm looking for. That's the memory of life as it was always meant to be and as it one day will be in the kingdom of God. And that's our calling as the church, to awaken that memory. My hope and prayer for you as you go through this day is that you'll be refreshed in your vision of what you're called to do and to be as the church. I think that's something that we all need to across the entire Church of England right now, just to step back sometimes from some of the things that have occupied us, maybe especially during the last year and a half of COVID, where we've been driving down into the detail of how we can keep church going during this time, to step back and see the wonder of what God has called us to do and to be, to find joy in declaring the praises of God to God and the praises of God to the world. I hope you have a wonderful day together, and thank you for listening and for enabling me to take part in your day together. God bless you all.